Hi folks, on this video what we're going to be talking about is patterns of inheritance, and so what we'll be looking at are some different vocabulary terms that are going to be really important, like dominant versus recessive alleles, homozygous versus heterozygous pairings, just alleles in general, genotypes versus versus phenotypes. And we'll talk a little bit about that in preparation for us to complete Punnett squares for some different genetic disorders that occur on various chromosomes. And so we need to have that basis. So that's what this video is going to set us up for. Okay, so the study of inheritance or patterns of inheritance were really discovered by Gregor Mendel, and basically came up to four conclusions. And the first one discussed that inheritance must be determined by factors, also later known as genes. So basically what happened is we got one copy of each gene from the parent, and so they essentially are randomly, we receive them, but whether we get the dominant or allele is just randomized. Okay, but we get one from the father, one from the mother, and that determines essentially that particular gene or that trait. And remember, genes are actually, they code for the production of proteins, and those proteins, there's 30,000 plus proteins in our body that make us up, essentially from hair to skin to teeth to eyes, everything. Okay, so uh, one thing he noticed was that some genes were more powerful than others. So, for example, if we had a dominant trait, it would show. So, by researching both purple and white flowers, he would say, well, why when I take two parents and one parent has a purple flower and the other has white, why would I produce all plants that were purple plants? So, why would that purple show when one was clearly white, the flowers, and the other one was purple? And so then what he realized is, well, one will show and you can have carriers and such, but that dominant allele will always prevail and it will always show in that relationship. So what we need to talk about next are what are alleles. And so if you take a look in the diagram over here, you'll see that there's a big P and a little p, and so that big P is going to be the dominant, and I'll just put dom. You can also note the dominant allele is written over there. And this little one is called recessive. Now think about the word dominant. Think about dominate. You're stronger, you're better. Okay, I like to play sports. So if we dominate a team, or if I dominate someone on the golf course, or if I get dominated on the golf course, then essentially what's happening is one person's coming out on top and is the winner. Okay, so in this case, we randomly receive these alleles. They pair up. We get one from mom, one from dad, and then it's randomized whether we get the dominant or the allele, so we can determine our pairing. So really, we could get a pairing with these P. We could get big P, which we see down here. We could get a big P, little p, or we could get two little p's. Now, in that case, we would have a dominant. This one would be dominant, two dominant. This one here would be two recessive, and this one would be heterozygous, one dominant, one recessive. So in this case, the dominant would show even though there's a recessive allele. This one, the dominant would show. And this one here would be a recessive trait would show because there's two of them. So they're usually a pair of alleles, and so that's called an allele pairing. And so those three combinations that I've showed you are going to, those three combinations I've showed you are going to be really important. So you'll actually see these combinations down at the bottom. So if you take a look down here, you'll see those combinations that I wrote up top. Oh, sorry, I covered one up. Oh, I'm all over the place with this pen today. But basically what that's showing is that from these crosses you can get different allele pairings. Okay, but note that the dominant allele is the large and the recessive allele is the small. Okay, so if you take a look at this flower down here, you'll notice that in this particular cross, any flower that ends up in an allele pairing with two small, so it'd be homozygous recessive, is going to be white. But notice that this one, where it is a heterozygous pairing, which means it has one dominant allele and one recessive allele, these will be purple, and note the color. And so the purple is because purple is the dominant allele. So it will show when paired with a recessive allele. And obviously this is purple because it's homozygous dominant. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are these terms, homozygous and heterozygous, that I'm talking about, just to help you build a little understanding of what I mean. So heterozygous pairing, or homozygous, means the same. So we could look at this version, or this portion of the word here, and we want to remember same. So homo means same, zygous means that it's an offspring. And then here we'll notice that hetero means it's going to be different. And so I'll just put diff. Okay, so it's going to be different. And so in this case, notice that the different means there's one large and one small allele, uppercase, lowercase. But in this case, the same. Notice that homozygous dominant is two dominant alleles. Homozygous meaning the same, so they're both the same. And homozygous recessive on this end is the recessive allele, but two of them paired together, so homozygous recessive. And then this is heterozygous, which means different, and notice that those are different there. So hopefully that makes sense. Difference between homozygous and heterozygous. Now we don't have to call heterozygous dominant because it's always dominant. It always dominates because it's dominant in the recessive allele, so we don't have to actually worry about that. So moving on. We are going to talk about now genotypes and phenotypes. So these are your percentages or your physical traits that actually show when you cross two parents. So in this case, genotype is the alleles that an individual possesses. So these are your alleles, your allele pairing, so dominant versus recessive, and the pairing that you have. And so we would actually look at this in terms of a percentage. So we would say of the offspring, there is a 25% chance of a offspring having or being a tongue roller. Okay, or maybe there's a 75% chance of being a tongue roller, and then 25% chance of being a non-tongue roller. So the genotype is going to be things like homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, heterozygous. Those allele pairings, so if I was to look at tongue rolling with R's, these are going to be your genotypes. So any of those that come out in your offspring. Okay, and this is leading us into Punnett squares. So homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Whereas the phenotype, on the other hand, is a little bit different. The phenotype is the physical trait that an individual possesses. So the phenotype is communicated via words, not letters. So we would say genotype is communicated through letters, and this is communicated through words. Okay? So the phenotype, for example, if I'm talking about tongue rolling, would be tongue roller or non-tongue roller. Okay? Whereas the genotype might be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, or also a heterozygous individual can be known as, can also be known as, a carrier. Okay? So carrier, heterozygous, same thing. Okay? So you have to know the difference between those two things. Genotype and a phenotype, as that'll lead us into our Punnett squares. Okay, and so with that, hopefully that helps. And next one will be on Punnett squares, different crosses. It gets a little more advanced at this point, so hopefully you're developing a little understanding. Okay, hope that helped.